There is a window of time every evening during which your arteries either repair themselves or accumulate more damage. Not slowly, not metaphorically, but through a precise biological process that your body initiates every night during the hours of sleep, and that is either supported or actively blocked by what you put in your body in the 3 to 4 hours before you close your eyes. Most people have never been told this window exists. Most people have never been told that the timing of what they eat matters for arterial health in ways that are entirely independent of the total quantity or nutritional content of what they consume over the course of the day. And most people are eating, in the hours between dinner and sleep, the 3 specific foods that shut this repair process down most effectively. I am going to name those foods, explain the precise mechanism by which each one blocks arterial repair, and give you what your arteries actually need during that window instead. I am Dr. David Miller. I have been practicing medicine for 15 years, and I built this channel on one principle. The information that could prevent the majority of cardiovascular events in people over 60 is available in the research literature. It is simply not making it into the conversations that happen in clinic waiting rooms because there is no revenue in telling someone to stop eating cheese after dinner. Subscribe to Dr. Miller right now and hit that like button. We are building a community of people who understand their own cardiovascular biology well enough to act on it. Every subscriber makes this channel more visible to the next person who needs it. Let me explain the repair window first, because without understanding it, the 3 foods are just a list. With it, they become a mechanism you can act on with genuine conviction. Your arteries are not static pipes. They are living tissue. The inner lining of every artery in your body, called the endothelium, is a single-cell thick layer of cells that regulates everything from blood vessel dilation and constriction to the prevention of clot formation and the control of inflammatory signaling within the vessel wall. The endothelium is the most metabolically active surface in the entire cardiovascular system. It is also among the most vulnerable. Every day, it sustains micro-injuries from the mechanical force of blood flow, from oxidative compounds circulating in the blood, from inflammatory signals generated by metabolic stress, and from the direct contact with whatever the diet has introduced into the circulation. The endothelium repairs these micro-injuries continuously, primarily during the overnight fasting and sleep period when the metabolic load on the cardiovascular system is lowest, inflammatory signaling is at its daily nadir, and the body's repair resources are directed toward tissue maintenance rather than digestion and metabolic processing. This repair process depends on 2 things. First, a sufficient supply of the biological raw materials required for endothelial cell regeneration and vascular wall remodeling, primarily nitric oxide, which is the molecule the endothelium produces to maintain vessel flexibility and prevent the adhesion of inflammatory cells to the vessel wall. Second, the absence of the specific compounds that block nitric oxide production, promote oxidative stress in the vessel wall, and trigger the inflammatory cascade that turns micro-injuries into the plaques that narrow and stiffen arteries over years. The overnight fasting window is the time when the body can most effectively run this repair program. What you eat in the hours before sleep determines whether that program runs at full capacity, runs at partial capacity, or is effectively shut down for the night. Let me tell you about a patient I will call Harold. He was 71 years old. He had a cardiovascular history, a stent placed 4 years earlier following a partial arterial blockage. He was on a statin, a blood pressure medication, and a low-dose aspirin. His cardiologist was satisfied with his numbers. His LDL was controlled, his blood pressure was acceptable, and Harold was doing what he believed he was supposed to do. He was watching his diet during the day, low fat, reasonable portions, not much red meat. But Harold had a habit he had not mentioned to his cardiologist because it had never occurred to him as relevant. Every evening, without exception, between 8 and 10 at night, Harold ate. Not a full meal. Crackers with cheese, sometimes a small bowl of cereal with milk, sometimes a glass of wine with a handful of salted nuts. He was not hungry for these things. They were comfort and routine. and they were, as I will explain, systematically blocking the arterial repair process his body was trying to run every single night. The first food is refined carbohydrates eaten after 6 p.m., and I want to be specific about what this means because the word carbohydrate has become so broad as to be almost useless. I am not talking about vegetables or legumes or even whole grains consumed with dinner. I am talking about the rapidly digested, high glycemic carbohydrates that cause a sharp spike in blood glucose within 30 to 60 minutes of consumption. White bread, crackers, breakfast cereals, cookies, rice cakes, sweetened yogurt, fruit juice, anything made with refined flour or added sugar. Harold's evening crackers were in this category. His cereal was in this category. Here is what happens inside the artery when blood glucose spikes in the evening hours. Glucose at elevated concentrations is directly toxic to endothelial cells. It binds to proteins in the cell membrane through a process called glycation, which stiffens them and impairs their function. It generates reactive oxygen species, which are unstable molecular fragments that damage the endothelial cell wall in the same way that oxidation damages metal. And it suppresses the activity of an enzyme called endothelial nitric oxide synthase, which is the enzyme responsible for producing nitric oxide, the molecule the artery needs to stay flexible, to prevent inflammatory cell adhesion, and to resist the formation of atherosclerotic plaque. A single evening glucose spike is not catastrophic, but a glucose spike happening in the same 3-hour window every night for years systematically suppresses nitric oxide production during the exact period when the artery is trying to repair itself. The repair window stays open. The repair tools are taken away. The circadian dimension of this problem makes it significantly worse than a daytime glucose spike of identical magnitude. In the evening hours, insulin sensitivity declines. The cells of the body become less responsive to insulin's signal to absorb glucose from the blood. This is a normal physiological adaptation, not a disease, driven by the circadian clock's preparation for the overnight fast. It means that the same quantity of refined carbohydrate consumed at 8 in the evening produces a higher and more prolonged blood glucose elevation than the same quantity consumed at noon. The artery is exposed to a greater glycemic insult for a longer duration precisely during the window it has allocated for repair, and this happens without any dramatic symptom, no pain, no warning. Just a sustained biochemical environment inside the vessel wall that prevents the repair from running. Subscribe to Dr. Miller and hit the like button. The circadian regulation of insulin sensitivity and its implications for evening carbohydrate consumption is something that most people have never been told and that most clinic visits do not have time to explain. This channel exists to close that gap. Hit subscribe. Every subscriber means the next person searching for this information finds it instead of a generic recommendation to eat less sugar. The second food is processed and cured meats consumed in the evening, and this includes the category that Harold considered harmless snacking. Salami, ham, sausage, pepperoni, smoked salmon, deli turkey, even the supposedly healthier versions of these products. The mechanism here is not primarily about saturated fat, which has a more complex relationship with cardiovascular risk than the simple narrative of the past 30 years suggested. The mechanism is about two specific compounds that processed meats deliver in concentrated form. Sodium nitrite, which is used as a preservative in virtually all cured and processed meats, and advanced glycation end products, abbreviated AGEs, which form in abundance when animal proteins are processed at high temperatures or exposed to preservative compounds during curing. Sodium nitrite in the context of processing generates nitrosamines in the digestive system, compounds that are directly pro-inflammatory, and that specifically promote oxidative stress in the endothelial layer of blood vessels. This is not the same nitric oxide that arteries produce for their own repair. Nitrosamines are chemically related but functionally opposite. Where endogenous nitric oxide protects the vessel wall and keeps it flexible, dietary nitrosamines from processed meats promote the oxidative damage that characterizes early atherosclerosis. The evening is a particularly damaging time for this exposure because the liver, which handles the metabolism and detoxification of these compounds, is moving toward its own overnight lower activity phase. Compounds that the liver might clear more efficiently at midday remain in circulation longer when introduced in the evening hours. Advanced glycation end products from processed meats add a second layer of damage. AGEs are compounds in which sugars have bonded to proteins or fats during the processing or cooking of food, the same glycation process that happens inside the artery when blood glucose is elevated, but now arriving preformed directly from the food. When circulating AGEs reach the endothelium, they bind to specific receptors on the cell surface called RAGE receptors. This binding activates an inflammatory cascade that promotes oxidative stress, increases the permeability of the endothelial barrier, and accelerates the adhesion of LDL cholesterol particles to the vessel wall. The LDL that his statin was controlling in Harold's blood was still adhering to his vessel wall more readily on the nights he ate his evening charcuterie, because the AGEs from the processed meat were activating the very receptors that make the wall sticky and receptive to plaque formation. The third food is alcohol consumed in the evening, and I want to address this one directly because it is the most socially embedded of the three and the one most patients are most resistant to hearing about. Harold's evening glass of wine was not an aberration, it was a ritual. And for many people over 60, the evidence around moderate alcohol and cardiovascular health has been interpreted as permission for a daily drink, often because of the widely repeated claim that red wine in particular is cardioprotective due to its resveratrol content. I need to be precise about what the current evidence actually says, because this area has shifted significantly in the last decade. The observational studies that suggested moderate alcohol consumption was protective had a methodological problem that has been well documented. They compared drinkers to non-drinkers without adequately accounting for the fact that many non-drinkers in those studies were former heavy drinkers who had stopped drinking due to health problems, making the non-drinker reference group systematically less healthy than the moderate drinker group and producing a false appearance of benefit in the moderate drinkers. Mendelian randomization studies, which use genetic data to approximate a natural experiment and avoid many of the confounders of observational research, consistently show no safe level of alcohol consumption for cardiovascular health and a linear relationship between alcohol intake and cardiovascular risk that begins at the first drink. The specific mechanism relevant to the overnight repair window is this. Alcohol is a direct suppressor of endothelial nitric oxide synthase, the enzyme that produces nitric oxide in the artery wall. It also generates acetaldehyde, a metabolic byproduct of alcohol breakdown that is directly toxic to endothelial cells, and that promotes oxidative stress in the vessel wall, and it disrupts the architecture of deep sleep, reducing the time spent in slow-wave sleep, which is the phase during which the parasympathetic nervous system reduces heart rate and blood pressure to their overnight lows, allowing the cardiovascular system its deepest period of rest and creating the conditions under which arterial repair is most effective. An evening drink that reduces deep sleep by even 30 minutes meaningfully shortens the repair window the artery has available. Harold was doing all three. Crackers and cheese at 9, which combined refined carbohydrates with processed dairy whose age content from pasteurization and aging is significant. A glass of wine. All three mechanisms operating simultaneously during the window his arteries had allocated for repair. All three of which his cardiologist had not specifically addressed because the conversation had been about his statin dose and his LDL number. Now I want to give you what the arteries actually need during the evening window, because eliminating three foods without understanding what to replace them with leaves a practical gap that willpower alone does not bridge consistently. The artery's primary requirement during the overnight repair window is an adequate supply of the precursors to nitric oxide production. The amino acid L-arginine is the direct substrate from which endothelial nitric oxide synthase produces nitric oxide. Foods high in L-arginine that can be consumed in the late afternoon or early evening without creating a glycemic burden include pumpkin seeds, walnuts, almonds, and legumes such as lentils and chickpeas. These foods consumed with or shortly after dinner provide the raw material for overnight nitric oxide synthesis without the glucose spike that would suppress the enzyme producing it. The second requirement is antioxidant support for the endothelial cell membrane. The evening oxidative burden from traffic, environmental pollutants, and the day's metabolic activity reaches the artery wall continuously, and the endothelial cell's defense against this burden depends on antioxidant enzymes that require adequate supplies of selenium, zinc, and polyphenols to function. Dark leafy greens consumed with dinner, a small amount of dark chocolate above 85% cacao in the evening, and green tea as an evening beverage rather than wine provide polyphenol compounds that support the endothelial antioxidant defense without suppressing nitric oxide production or disrupting sleep architecture. The third requirement is the absence of late inflammatory signaling, which means that the last food you eat before sleep should not be a food that triggers insulin release, activates age receptors, or generates nitrosamines. A small handful of walnuts or a modest serving of plain Greek yogurt without added sugar are the late evening options I give patients who cannot sleep without having eaten something. Both provide nutrients without triggering the inflammatory cascades of the three foods I described. Walnuts specifically contain alpha-linolenic acid, a plant-based omega-3 fatty acid, and ellagic acid, a polyphenol, both of which have documented endothelial protective effects in the literature. How old are you? Write it in the comments right now. I want to see the age range of this audience because it shapes everything I make next. If most of you are in your 60s, I want to go deeper on the reversibility of early plaque formation with consistent dietary change, because the research on this is more encouraging than the conventional narrative of irreversible arterial damage. If many of you are in your 70s, I want to address what the evidence shows about arterial flexibility recovery at that stage and which specific interventions produce the most significant measurable improvement in endothelial function. Harold came back to see me 4 months after our first appointment. He had removed the evening crackers and replaced them with a small bowl of walnuts and pumpkin seeds. He had stopped the evening wine and replaced it with green tea. He had eliminated the processed meats entirely. His cardiologist, at his next scheduled follow-up, ordered a repeat measurement of his endothelial function using a non-invasive test that measures how well the artery dilates in response to increased blood flow. This measurement, called flow-mediated dilation, had improved measurably compared to his baseline. His cardiologist noted it and attributed it to the statin working better. Harold told him about the dietary changes. His cardiologist listened carefully, acknowledged the mechanism, and said he was going to start asking his other patients about their evening eating habits. That conversation between a patient who understood his own biology and a physician who was open to what the patient had learned is exactly what this channel is trying to produce. Your arteries are not simply the sum of their plaque, they are living tissue with the capacity to repair, to restore flexibility, and to reverse the early stages of damage when the biochemical environment supports that reversal. The repair window exists every night. What you eat in the hours before it opens determines whether it runs or whether it is blocked by 3 foods that most people do not connect to their cardiovascular risk at all because nobody has ever explained the mechanism. I am Dr. David Miller, and I have spent 15 years watching the gap between cardiovascular research and cardiovascular conversation in the clinic cost people function and years. The 3 foods I described today are in most people's evening routine precisely because nobody told them specifically why they were damaging and precisely when the damage was occurring. Now you know both. Subscribe to Dr. Miller, hit the like button. Share this with someone on a statin who has been told their numbers are controlled and has never been told that what they eat at 9 in the evening is actively blocking the repair process their artery runs every night. Numbers on a lab panel are not the whole story. The biology in the hours between dinner and sleep is part of the story too. Subscribe if that matters to you. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute personalized medical advice. If you have a cardiovascular history or are on cardiovascular medications, please speak with your physician before making significant dietary changes. The mechanisms discussed here are supported by published research and should be explored in partnership with a qualified healthcare provider who knows your individual medical history.